a feared Mafia boss arrives home earlier than usual and freezes at what he sees inside. The sound hit Declan Voss before he even crossed the threshold. Piano. Someone was playing the piano on Elena's Steinway Grand, the instrument he had ordered sealed shut 10 months earlier, the night his wife took a bullet meant for him and bled out in his arms on a restaurant floor. And the melody. God, the melody was Claire de Lune, her song. The one she played every Sunday while their daughters curled up beside her on the bench, the one that died when she did. Declan stood frozen in the corridor of his own fortress, a loaded weapon under his jacket and no air left in his lungs, staring at the impossible scene unfolding in his living room. The new housekeeper, Nova Ellis, 27, hired 2 weeks earlier to scrub floors and be invisible, sat at the piano in her wrinkled gray uniform, looking like a visual profanity against the instrument's flawless finish. She looked like a cleaner, but her fingers moved across those keys like a concert pianist. Every note was precise, every phrase soaked in a tenderness that had no business existing inside these walls. But it wasn't the girl who made the most feared man on the eastern seaboard feel his chest crack open. It was his daughters. Thea, 7 years old, silent for 10 months straight, mute to every therapist, every doctor, every prayer, sat beside Nova on that bench, swaying, lips parted, eyes glistening with something dangerously close to life. And Iris, 5, the one who cried herself to sleep every single night, was curled beneath the bench with her cheek against Nova's ankle, sound asleep, wearing the first smile Declan had seen on her face in almost a year. He had hired 6 specialists, spent hundreds of thousands, enforced silence like a law, because silence was safe. Silence meant no one got attached. Silence meant no one got destroyed again. None of it worked. And this girl, this nobody with cleaning solution on her arms and holes in her shoes, had done in 2 weeks what his entire empire couldn't buy. For 1 second, Declan wanted to walk in, sit down, and let the music take him somewhere before the blood. But the iron in him, forged by violence, hardened by loss, locked his jaw shut. Hope was the most dangerous weapon in the world. Hand it to his daughters, then rip it away, and the damage would be fatal. He stepped forward. His shoe cracked against the marble like a gunshot. The music stopped, and when Nova turned around and met his eyes, dark, furious, barely human, the smile vanished from her face and she knew exactly what was coming. Like this video right now, because this moment of forbidden music is about to unleash a war inside the Voss empire that no bullet can stop. Subscribe and share so you don't miss what happens next. Declan Voss strode into the living room like a storm trying to hold itself back. Each step on the marble floor was slow, deliberate, carrying the weight of a man accustomed to commanding an entire city to bow its head. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. His voice came out like a razor skimming glass, low, dark, and so sharp it seemed to slice the air between them. Who gave you permission to touch that piano? Nova Ellis sprang up from the piano bench as if the seat had just caught fire. The yellow rubber gloves she'd tossed on the lid a moment earlier now looked like an accusation lying squarely at the scene. She took a step back, her spine meeting the piano side, and the cold of the wood seeped through her thin uniform fabric, making her shiver. "Mr. Voss, I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" Declan lifted one hand. Just a small motion, but it was enough to make Nova swallow the rest of her sentence whole. He advanced one more step and his shadow fell over her like a building swallowing a sidewalk. "Your apologies are useless to me. I asked for a name. Who gave you the authority?" Nova swallowed. Her throat was bone dry, but she knew that if she didn't speak now, there wouldn't be another chance. Iris cried for hours. No one could soothe her. The nanny tried everything and then went to lie down. Thea locked herself in the corner, hugging a pillow and looking at no one. She paused, her voice trembling, forcing it into steadiness. "I just thought maybe music would help. I didn't know this piano was—" Was what? Declan cut in, his tone flat as a frozen lake. The piano my wife played every night before she died. The one thing in this house I ordered no one to touch. That isn't it, Miss Ellis. Each question landed like a stone thrown straight into Nova's chest. She had no shield. She was only a new housekeeper hired 2 weeks earlier, paid just enough to buy her mother's medicine through this month. Standing in front of a man whose name the city's own officials didn't dare to say out loud. "Close the lid," Declan said, turning away. "Pack your things. Griffin will pay you through the end of the week." The floor seemed to tilt under Nova's feet. Fired. Of course she was fired. She'd known it from the moment she'd heard his shoes striking stone that this would be the ending. She stepped toward the piano, reached for the lid to close it, and then Iris's cry ripped through the silence. The little girl had woken beneath the bench, eyes wide with panic because the music was gone. "Miss Piano!" Iris screamed, the name shattering in the vast living room like a fledgling falling from its nest. She scrambled out from under the bench and ran toward Nova on short legs, her face flushed, tears smearing both cheeks. But it wasn't Iris's crying that made Declan stop. It was Thea, 7 years old, still seated on the piano bench, not crying, not shouting, not running. She did only one thing. Thea reached out, took hold of Nova's uniform sleeve, and held on. 5 tiny fingers clung to wrinkled gray fabric with a desperate strength no 7-year-old should ever have. 10 months. 10 months this child hadn't spoken, hadn't cried, hadn't touched anyone. Not the nanny, not the doctors, not her grandfather, and not him, her own father. 6 of the best psychologists Declan's money could buy had spent hundreds of hours in a playroom stocked with expensive toys, trying to make Thea react to anything, to anyone. They'd all failed. And now the child was gripping the sleeve of a floor-cleaning girl as if it were the last buoy in the middle of an ocean. Declan stared at his daughter's hand on a stranger's arm, and something inside his chest twisted, burning. Sharper than any bullet he'd ever managed to avoid. Not anger. Worse than anger. Jealousy. A raw, deranged, primitive jealousy of a father realizing his daughter had chosen a complete stranger instead of choosing him, that he, Declan Voss, the man who controlled everything, couldn't control the distance between himself and his own flesh and blood. He turned away. He walked. He didn't look back. Griffin. His voice echoed down the dark hallway. Griffin appeared near the staircase as if he'd been standing there all along, waiting. The loyal guard's face showed nothing, but his eyes had seen everything. "Prepare the termination paperwork, effective tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir." Declan stepped into his study and pulled the heavy oak door shut behind him. The room was pitch black. He didn't turn on the light. He stood still in the darkness, both hands braced on the desk, head bowed, listening to Iris still crying on the other side of the wall. Miss Piano, don't go." Her voice pierced wood and concrete, pierced the armor Declan had spent 15 years building, and drove straight into the place he'd believed had died with Elena. Declan Voss stood alone in his blackened study, and for the first time in 10 months, he didn't know who he was angry at. The girl who dared to touch his wife's piano, or himself, the man who had closed that piano's lid and convinced himself that silence could protect anyone. That night, the Voss estate sank into a silence thicker than any it had known before. In the evening, the nanny placed a plate of food outside Thea's bedroom door. The plate was untouched later. Still untouched, even later. She knocked, called the girl's name, coaxed her with the even, professionally trained tone she'd mastered over years, then tried again with a firmer voice, and finally stood outside the door looking at Griffin with eyes that quietly admitted defeat. Iris, on the other hand, did not fall silent. She cried until her voice turned into a hoarse, rasping breath, and the tears stopped flowing, leaving only dry sobs that shook her small body from head to toe. The nanny picked her up, set her down, picked her up again, but Iris pushed everything away. "Miss Piano," she repeated over and over, her voice no longer quite a voice at all, just breath shaped into those two words. Later that night, Iris was exhausted and fell asleep on the living room sofa, her face still damp, her hands clenched tight as if holding on to something invisible that no one else could see. Griffin stood outside Declan's study door for 30 minutes before knocking. He knew his employer well. He knew that behind that door, Declan Voss was sitting in the dark, not drinking, not checking his phone, simply sitting and listening to Iris's crying through the wall until it faded. Griffin had followed Declan for 15 years. He'd seen him walk through negotiations no ordinary man would have survived. He'd seen him make decisions so cold they made rooms full of hardened men hold their breath. But Griffin also knew something very few people in this world knew. Declan Voss was afraid of his two daughters. Not afraid of them, afraid of losing them. Afraid of watching them turn into silent shadows, drifting through this house that was far too large. Afraid that he'd ruin them with the very thing he believed would protect them. In the early morning hours, Griffin knocked. "Sir, Thea is sitting in front of the piano. The lid is still closed. She has both hands resting on it and she hasn't moved. It's been hours." Silence behind the door. Then the sound of a chair scraping against wood. Declan opened the door. He didn't speak. He walked past Griffin and moved down the dark hallway toward the living room. He stopped at the threshold. The lights were off. Only moonlight slipped through the floor-to-ceiling windows, laying a pale silver stripe across the stone floor, and within that stripe, Thea sat on the piano bench. Her back was straight. Her small hands rested on the closed black lid, 10 fingers spread across the cold surface, positioned exactly where they would be if the lid were open and the keys revealed beneath. She didn't turn when she heard her father's footsteps. She didn't react. She didn't move. She simply sat there and waited, patient and desperate at once, like a pilgrim kneeling before a locked temple door, still believing someone would open it. Declan stepped closer. He stood directly behind his daughter. He looked down at her hands on the lid, and for an instant he saw other hands layered over them. Elena's hands, longer, paler, with the gold wedding ring he'd placed on her finger 10 years earlier. The image vanished as quickly as it came, but the pain did not. He raised his hand, rested it on the lid. His fingers touched the edge of the wood, just inches from Thea's. One movement. Open the lid. Allow the music to return. Allow life to return. But Declan Voss did not open the piano, because opening it meant admitting that the silence he'd imposed on this house for 10 months had been wrong. That he, the man who'd never been wrong in any room he'd ever entered, had been wrong inside his own home. He pulled his hand back, turned away, walked into the hallway where Griffin was still waiting. Declan stopped. He didn't look at Griffin, his eyes fixed on the opposite wall, but he saw nothing there except the image of his daughter's hands on the closed piano lid. When he spoke, his voice was so low Griffin had to lean in to hear it. "Call Miss Ellis tomorrow morning, but there are conditions." Griffin waited. "She may play the piano only for the children, only when the children ask. And Claire de Lune is never to be played, never again in this house." Griffin nodded. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He understood that Declan had just yielded more than anything he'd witnessed in 15 years. That a door had cracked open, even if only by the thinnest sliver. And for a man who'd built walls around himself from concrete and morning, even a sliver was enough to let the light in. Nova Ellis returned to the Voss estate the following morning, an old duffel bag slung over her shoulder and a white envelope in her hand. Griffin met her at the gate, neither smiling nor cold, simply handing her a folded sheet of paper and speaking in the flat, practiced tone of a man used to delivering orders without adding or subtracting a single word. "Mr. Voss's rules. Read them carefully. Sign. No exceptions." Nova unfolded the paper right there on the front steps. The list wasn't long, but every line was sharp as a razor. First, play only when the children ask, never on your own initiative. Second, no Claire de Lune, never under any circumstances. Third, do not speak about Elena. Do not mention Elena's name. Do not answer if the children ask about Elena. Fourth, invisible to Mr. Voss. If he enters a room, you leave it. Fifth, this is your final chance. Nova signed her name. Her hand didn't shake, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she'd been afraid of worse things than losing a job, afraid of the breathing machine in her mother's hospital room, afraid of the doctor's voice saying, "We need to discuss the next option," afraid of opening her bank account and seeing a number that couldn't even buy 1 week of medication. Compared to those fears, a list of rules from a Mafia boss was just paper and ink. During the first week, Nova followed every rule without deviation. She played Chopin in the mornings when Iris tugged her hand and dragged her to the piano. Gentle knocks, rounded and safe, none of them brushing against forbidden ground. Iris sat on her lap and pressed her fingers down on the keys at random, completely off rhythm, then laughed every time an unexpected sound appeared. By the third day, Iris gave Nova a name. "Miss Piano," she shouted down the hallway whenever she saw Nova step out of the laundry room. "Miss Piano, play the elephant song." Nova didn't know what song the elephant song was, so she improvised a heavy, lumbering bass line and then drifted into lighter high notes. And Iris decided that was exactly the elephant song she wanted to hear. Iris's laughter spread through the house like water seeping into cracks in dry ground, slow, patient, filling each small, empty space. Thea was different. She didn't laugh, didn't clap, didn't call Nova by any name. But every day when Nova sat at the piano, Thea appeared. On the first day, she stood in the living room doorway about 6 meters from the piano. On the second day, she stood near the window, 3 steps closer. On the fourth day, she sat on the rug an arm's length from the piano bench. By the end of the week, she sat on the sofa right beside it, close enough that Nova could hear the small, steady rhythm of her breathing shift with the music. Quicker when the tempo rose, slower when the melody softened. Thea was listening. Thea was feeling. Thea was coming back to life, little by little, silent and patient like a flower forcing its way through a crack in concrete. Nova obeyed the fourth rule, invisible to Declan. Whenever she heard his footsteps in the hallway, she stopped playing, stood up, and quietly slipped out through the side door before he could enter the room. They hadn't spoken a single word to each other since that night. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Nova finished all her cleaning each day, played for the children in the afternoon, and disappeared into the small staff room behind the house at night. She didn't eat with the kitchen staff because she wasn't sure she was allowed to. No one had told her she could, and she didn't want to ask and hear no. So every night when the house was asleep, Nova slipped into the kitchen and ate whatever was left in the refrigerator. Half a box of wilted salad, a stray slice of bread, a few pieces of cheese the cook hadn't thrown out yet. She ate standing up, ate quickly, ate in the dark because she didn't want to turn on the light, and every bite carried the taste of restraint she'd known all her life. One night, she was standing by the sink with a stale piece of bread in her hand when the light snapped on. Nova spun around. Declan Voss stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand still on the light switch. He wore a black shirt with the collar unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos running along his left forearm, and he looked as though he'd stepped out of his study rather than out of bed. His eyes went to the bread in Nova's hand, then to her hand itself. He looked longer than necessary at the calluses in her palm from scrubbing floors and washing linens, at fingers that remained long and graceful despite the labor. Fingers born to glide over ivory keys, not to wring out rags. Nova stood frozen, the bread turning into evidence of a poverty she'd been hiding for 3 weeks. She waited for him to speak. A cutting remark, a cold question, an order. But Declan Voss said nothing. He turned the light off. Darkness returned. His footsteps faded down the hallway until there was only silence and the sound of Nova's heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, when Nova entered the kitchen to begin her work, there was a breakfast tray on the small staff table. Hot scrambled eggs, buttered toast, a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice, a cup of black coffee, milk set aside beside it. No note, no name. The cook was busy preparing breakfast for the children and didn't look up when Nova walked in, but she called out in a normal voice as if this were nothing worth discussing. "From now on, there's breakfast for you every morning. Orders from upstairs." Nova sat down. She stared at the tray and had to bite the inside of her lip to keep her eyes from burning, because it was the first full breakfast she'd eaten in 3 months without paying for it, without asking for it, and without stealing it in the dark. That afternoon, Nova sat at the piano as she did every day. Iris skipped over, climbed onto the bench, and demanded the elephant song. Thea appeared as usual and sat close beside her. Nova played Chopin, then a gentle passage of Beethoven, then the elephant song for Iris. Iris clapped, laughed, and ran off to find Griffin to announce that the elephant could fly today. The living room was left with only Nova and Thea. Nova started to stand, then felt a small hand close around her wrist. Thea's. The girl didn't look at Nova. Her eyes were fixed on the keys, but the small hand pulled Nova's hand down, slow and firm, and placed it on the piano. Then Thea looked up, and in those 7-year-old eyes, Nova saw a plea so clear it needed no sound at all. Play. Play my mother's song. Nova looked into those eyes and felt her heart split in two, because she knew exactly which piece Thea was asking for, and she also knew exactly what would happen if she played it. Nova looked into Thea's eyes and knew she was standing before a choice with no safe answer. To play Claire de Lune meant breaking rule number 2, the one rule Declan Voss had underlined twice, the rule he hadn't phrased as "you shouldn't" or "keep it limited," but as "never." Playing it meant being fired a second time, and this time there would be no early morning call to pull her back. It meant losing the only job keeping her mother's medication paid for each month. But not playing meant looking into those pleading eyes and saying no. It meant closing the piano lid over small hands that were reaching for someone for the first time in 10 months. It meant doing exactly what Declan Voss had done, choosing safety instead of choosing a child. Nova had lost enough in her life to understand something people who have never lost anything will never understand. Sometimes a door opens only once, and if you don't step through in that moment, it closes forever. Thea was opening her door right now, in this very instant, and if Nova turned away, that door might never open again. Nova drew a deep breath. She placed both hands on the keys, and she played. The first notes of Claire de Lune fell into the living room like raindrops landing on the surface of a still lake, gentle and slow. Each note sent a ring of ripples outward, touching every wall, every shadowed corner, every empty space silence had occupied for 10 months. Nova played from memory because she had no sheet music in front of her. But Claire de Lune is the kind of piece anyone who has ever studied piano carries in bone and tendon, in fingers that remember every interval, every rest, every hush, between 2 notes that lives between 2 heartbeats. The melody filled the room. Afternoon sunlight poured through the enormous windows, bathing everything in honey gold, laying itself over Nova's blonde hair, over Thea's small shoulders, over the glossy black piano that for 10 months had known only darkness and silence. Iris heard the music from the next room and ran in, and instead of bouncing and demanding the elephant song the way she did every day, she stopped in the doorway. She didn't understand this music. She was too young to remember her mother playing it, but she felt something inside the melody that made her walk forward softly, climb onto the bench, and sit still beside her sister. Then Thea cried. There were no sobs, no sniffles. The tears simply spilled from her eyes, silent and steady, like an underground spring finally finding a way to the surface after 10 months buried. Thea cried without covering her face, without lowering her head, her eyes still open, watching the keys move under Nova's hands. And on the girl's face, there was not pain, but something closer to relief, as if she'd carried a stone in her chest for 10 months, and at last, someone had allowed her to set it down. Nova didn't stop. She didn't turn to look at Thea because she knew that if she looked, she would cry too, and she wouldn't be able to keep playing. She kept going, her vision blurring, her fingers guided by memory rather than sight. And when little Iris rested her head against Nova's arm and Thea leaned until her shoulder touched Nova's, Nova felt the weight of the two children leaning into her, like two fledglings finding shelter after 10 months flying in a storm. Nova played the piece through to the end. The final note dissolved into the air, light and sad and so beautiful it didn't truly end so much as blend into the stillness, as if it had always been there, only waiting for someone to call it back. Then Nova lifted her hands from the keys, turned, and gathered both children into her arms. Thea was still crying, quiet and even, and for the first time in 10 months, her tears were not the tears of freezing, but the tears of thawing. No one in the room saw the door at the end of the hallway crack open just wide enough for a man to stand in the darkness and look in. Declan Voss stood there. He didn't know how long he'd been there. It might have been from the first note. It might have been from before that. His right hand braced on the doorframe, and that hand was trembling. Not trembling with anger, though he wanted to be angry, wanted to step in and shout that she had broken the rules, that she had dared to play the piece he'd forbidden, that she had no right to bring Elena back into this room. But the anger didn't come. What came instead was something 100 times worse than anger. That music. Clair de Lune. The piece he had sealed away because it was the sharpest blade cutting into his memory every time it sounded. The piece he believed would kill him from the inside if he heard it again had just been played from beginning to end in his house. And he had stood and listened and had not died. He had stood and listened, and the only thing he felt was not pain. It was longing. He remembered Elena sitting on that bench, tilting her head to the left when she reached the middle passage, and smiling at him, smiling at the children, smiling because she was alive and loving and home on an ordinary Sunday afternoon that neither of them knew would be one of the last ordinary Sundays they would ever have. Declan remembered Elena smiling, and for the first time in 10 months that memory was not a fire that burned him, but a warm candle in a cold room. He turned away. He walked back into the hallway darkness, his fist clenched so tightly his knuckles blanched beneath the skin. He didn't enter the living room. He didn't order her to stop. He didn't call Griffin. He simply walked. And with each step, he felt something in the concrete wall he'd built around himself beginning to crack, slowly and irreversibly. The way ice breaks when spring arrives, not with an explosion, but with tiny, delicate fractures that, by the time you can hear them, are already too late to stop. Eleanor Voss arrived at the estate on an unannounced Saturday morning, exactly as she always did, because giving notice meant admitting she needed permission. And Eleanor Voss needed no one's permission to walk anywhere, least of all the house she believed would always belong to the Voss bloodline, regardless of who lived inside it. The black Bentley stopped at the gate. The driver opened the door. Eleanor stepped out in a perfectly tailored cream knit suit, silver hair swept into a flawless bun without a strand out of place. Pearl earrings Elena had once admired at Christmas. The last Christmas before everything fell apart. She passed through the iron gates along the stone path, and the moment the front door opened, she knew something was different. First, the flowers. A fresh bouquet sat on the entry table. Simple white daisies, inexpensive, not the kind Eleanor would ever have chosen, yet clearly cut that morning, the stems still wet. For 10 months there had been no flowers in this house. Declan had ordered them all removed because Elena loved flowers, and their presence made her absence feel larger. Then there was the piano. Even though the notes were scattered and uneven, unmistakably pressed by childish hands rather than played by an adult, the sound of a piano filled this house for the first time since the funeral. and Eleanor felt as though she had been struck across the face. Then Iris came running. Bare feet slapped against the cold stone floor as she raced down the hallway, cheeks flushed, mouth stretched wide in a grin, and crashed straight into Eleanor's legs. "Grandma, Grandma, I know how to play the elephant's song now. Miss Piano taught me." Eleanor froze, not because her granddaughter was hugging her, but because of those two words. Miss Piano, a name she had never heard, a person she had never known existed in this house. She looked up and saw her. Nova Ellis stood at the far end of the hallway, hurriedly peeling off yellow rubber gloves, wrinkled gray uniform, blonde hair tied messily with an elastic band, cheeks flushed from running out of the living room. Young, beautiful, in the way people who cannot afford expensive cosmetics are beautiful, natural, and unpolished. And that was precisely what made it dangerous. Eleanor studied Nova for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds were enough. She had lived 63 years and had judged hundreds of people correctly in mere moments. Young, poor, influential over her grandchild, dangerous. Eleanor smiled at Nova with the perfect polite smile she reserved for restaurant servers and grocery cashiers, the kind that acknowledged existence without acknowledging worth. Then she turned to Iris, smoothed the child's hair, and walked straight toward Declan's study without saying a single word to Nova. Declan was seated behind his desk, eyes fixed on his laptop screen, and he did not look up when his mother entered. "I know you're here," he said, "parking cameras." "Of course you do." Eleanor sat in the chair opposite him, back straight, hands folded on her lap. "My question is why you didn't tell me you'd brought a young, attractive girl into the house to live with my grandchildren." "She's the housekeeper, Mother. Housekeepers don't teach my grandchildren piano. Housekeepers aren't given personal nicknames by my grandchildren. Housekeepers scrub floors and go home." Declan looked up. "What do you want?" Eleanor did not bother circling the point. Fire her. Hire a proper psychologist. Someone credentialed, experienced, with age. Not a 27-year-old girl you know nothing about except that she plays the piano and has large eyes. Declan looked at his mother, his expression flat, the kind of look men across negotiation tables had learned to fear. "I hired 6 specialists, the best in the city, the best on the East Coast, each with a different method, each with promises, each with a 6-figure invoice. Do you know the result? None of them made Thea cry." Eleanor's brow creased slightly. "Cry." "Cry, Mother," my daughter cried, for the first time in 10 months. "Do you understand what that means? It means something inside her is coming back to life. And if you think I will cut off the only source making that happen just because you don't like the girl, then you don't understand me." Eleanor did not reply. She held her silence, the kind she had used her entire life to unsettle people more than any words could. Then she rose, gave a single curt nod, and left the study, but she did not head for the gate. She walked toward the living room, her steps slowed as she passed the mantel where Declan and Elena's wedding photograph still sat in its silver frame. Eleanor stopped. She looked at Elena's face in the picture, the radiant smile, the eyes full of life, and she lifted a hand to touch the edge of the frame with fingers that trembled slightly. Her eyes filled. No one saw. Elena would not want a stranger to replace her, she whispered, her voice no longer sharp but fragile. Fragile in the way of an old woman speaking to the dead, because Declan Voss had lost Elena too. She had lost the daughter-in-law she loved, the only woman she had ever deemed worthy of her son, the woman who had turned this cold house into a home. That grief was real. But where Declan turned grief into a wall of silence, Eleanor turned it into a need for control. If she could not control death, she would control everything else. She wiped her eyes with a quick, precise motion, turned her back on the photograph, and walked on. She moved down the hallway toward the staff quarters at the back of the house. Nova's room was unlocked, as staff rooms in the Voss estate never were. No lock was needed when the entire house was a fortress of cameras and guards. Eleanor stepped inside. The room was small, orderly to the point of near emptiness. A neatly made single bed, an old duffel bag tucked beneath it, a few garments hanging in an open closet, none worth more than $20, and on the small table beside the bed a worn photograph with curled edges in a cheap plastic frame. Eleanor picked it up and stood very still. In the picture, Nova Ellis stood on a stage. Not just any stage, the stage of Juilliard. She wore a long black gown, hair swept up, bowing to an audience with the smile of someone who had just conquered the world. A pianist, not a housekeeper. Eleanor placed the photograph back exactly where it had been, stepped out of the room, closed the door without a sound, and walked straight to the car. The Bentley rolled out through the estate gates. Eleanor sat in the back seat, posture still rigid, eyes forward, and took out her phone. She dialed a number. The call was answered after 2 rings. "I need you to investigate someone," Eleanor said, her voice once again cold steel. "Nova Ellis, formerly at Juilliard. Find everything about her, especially anything that could be used to remove her from that house. I want results within 1 week." That night, Nova couldn't sleep. Not because the bed was hard or the room was cold. She'd been used to both long before she ever set foot in the Voss estate, but because her mind refused to slow down. The image of Thea crying beside the piano that afternoon kept replaying, and with it came the question she was afraid to answer. Did Declan know? Had he heard Claire de Lune? And if he had, why was she still here? The clock on the wall read 11:45 when Nova decided to go down to the kitchen for a glass of water. She wore sleep pants and went barefoot because she didn't want to make a sound. Moving lightly across the icy stone floor along the dark hallway, past the living room where the Steinway piano stood motionless in the moonlight, then turning left toward the kitchen. She was halfway there when she heard voices. Not the television, not the radio. Human voices, more than one, coming from Declan's study at the far end of the right hallway. The heavy oak door cracked open by perhaps 10 centimeters, just enough for a strip of yellow light to spill out and draw a long line across the dark stone floor. Nova hadn't meant to stop. Her feet had already carried her forward toward the kitchen, but a sentence slipped through the narrow gap and froze her in the middle of the hallway. He has 2 choices. Declan's voice, but not the Declan she knew. Not the low voice that had said, "Close the lid." Not the nearly broken whisper in the early morning when he called her back. This was a completely different voice, flat, cold, precise down to each syllable, as if every word had been weighed before leaving his mouth. There was no emotion in it, no anger, no mercy, no hesitation, only truth spoken by a man with the absolute power to turn words into reality. He disappears from the city before dawn, or he never leaves the city again. Either option is fine. I don't care. Nova stood perfectly still. Through the narrow opening, she could see the study. Declan sat behind the wooden desk, back against his chair, both hands resting on the tabletop with the ease of someone fully in control. Griffin stood to his right, arms folded, face expressionless like carved stone. Across from the desk sat 2 men Nova had never seen in the house, backs straight but shoulders slightly inclined forward, the posture of men receiving orders rather than engaging in conversation. One of them said something Nova couldn't hear clearly. Declan tilted his head to one side, just slightly, a small motion that carried the weight of a sentence. "I don't remember asking for your opinion," he said. "I'm informing you." This was not the father Nova had seen holding Iris on the sofa in the early morning when she had nightmares. Not the man standing with trembling hands behind a cracked door, listening to Claire de Lune. This was Declan Voss as the East Coast knew him. The man the police wouldn't investigate, judges wouldn't sign warrants against, and the hardest men in the city bowed their heads when his name was spoken. This was the other side of the door. Nova took a step back. Her bare foot met the cold stone floor, and she realized her hand was clenched tightly around the glass she'd brought down from her room. She needed to leave, needed to go back upstairs, needed to forget what she'd just heard. But as she turned, her elbow brushed the edge of a small statue on the hallway shelf, and the glass slipped from her hand. The sound of glass shattering on marble in the dead of night exploded like a bomb. Everything happened within 2 seconds. Inside the study, all 4 men snapped toward the door. Griffin reflexively moved a hand toward his belt, where Nova knew he always carried something she never wanted to see clearly. The 2 unfamiliar men jumped to their feet, chairs scraping back with a shriek against the floor. And Declan looked straight through the crack in the door, through the band of light, and saw Nova. His eyes met hers. And in that instant, Nova saw something she had never seen in those gray eyes. Not anger, not coldness, fear. Declan Voss was afraid, not afraid of her. Afraid because she had seen, afraid because the world he kept hidden behind the oak door had spilled out and touched the one person in the house he never wanted it to reach. Silence stretched. Declan signaled the 2 unfamiliar men with a slight nod. They rose, exited through the rear door of the study without a word, and vanished as if they had never existed. The room was empty. Only Declan behind the desk, Griffin beside him, and Nova standing in the hallway amid shards of broken glass, barefoot, hair loose, trembling, but not running. Declan stood, walked into the hallway, stopped 3 steps from Nova, looked down at the fragments of glass around her bare feet, then lifted his gaze to her eyes. "You shouldn't be here at this hour." His voice wasn't cold like before, but it wasn't warm either. Neutral, guarded. The voice of a man weighing what to do with a situation he hadn't anticipated. Nova swallowed. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure the entire hallway could hear it. But when she spoke, her voice didn't shake as much as she'd expected. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Voss. I knew from the first week I stepped into this house." Declan didn't move. "This house has cameras in every corner," Nova continued, and she could hear her voice growing steadier. Not because she was brave, but because she was too tired to pretend ignorance. "Fingerprint locks on every door. Armed guards patrolling 24 hours a day. I clean your room every day. I see what hangs in your closet and what's locked in your drawers. I'm not stupid. I never was." Silence. Griffin looked at Declan. Declan looked at Nova. Then he asked in a tone she hadn't expected. Soft, almost curious, as if the answer truly mattered to him. "Then why did you stay?" Nova met his gaze. Those gray eyes and the yellow spill of light from the study looked like a sky before a storm, heavy with clouds and wind, but still holding one small patch not yet covered. "Because Thea needs me," Nova said. "And because you, whoever you are out there, whatever you do behind that door in this house, you are a father trying to keep 2 children from drowning. I've seen you hold Iris in the early morning when she had nightmares. I've seen you stand behind a door listening to your daughter cry because you're afraid to go in. I'm not afraid of a man like that." No one spoke for a stretch long enough that Nova counted 7 of her own breaths. Then Declan turned to Griffin. "Clean the glass. Make sure she doesn't cut her feet." He walked past Nova toward the dark hallway, but at the threshold he stopped. He didn't turn around. "From now on, don't move around the house after 11 at night." A pause. "Not because of me. Because there are things you don't need to see anymore." Then he stepped into the darkness and disappeared. Griffin looked at Nova. Nova looked at Griffin. The older guard said nothing, vanished into a side room, and returned with a broom and dustpan. He knelt and carefully swept the shards of glass away from Nova's feet, gentle and precise. And when he stood, he spoke very softly, just for her. 15 years I've followed him. No one has ever spoken to him the way you just did, and still been standing here to tell the story." Nova didn't know whether that was praise or a warning. Perhaps it was both. 3 weeks passed after the night the glass shattered and no one mentioned it again. Not a word, not a single look that hinted, as if the dark hallway that night, the shards on the stone floor, the sentence, "A man like that doesn't scare me," and Declan's voice ordering someone to vanish from the city were all just a dream they both woke from and chose not to tell. But something had changed. Small. Almost invisible, unless you watched closely. Before that night, whenever Nova entered a room, Declan left it. Rule number 4, invisible. But now he didn't leave anymore. On a Tuesday afternoon, Nova was playing Chopin for Iris in the living room when Declan passed by in the hallway. In the past, he would have walked straight through, his pace never slowing by a beat. That day, he stopped only for 2 seconds. He leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, eyes on Iris sitting in Nova's lap pressing keys at random, and he asked in the same ordinary tone someone might use to ask about the weather. "What is she learning?" Nova almost missed a note. "The elephant song, sir." "Doesn't sound much like an elephant." "Because this is a flying elephant, Papa," Iris called back, utterly unaware of how extraordinary it was that her father had stopped on his own in a room with Nova when no one had asked him to. Declan didn't smile, but the corner of his mouth twitched so quickly it was almost imaginary. And then he walked away. That was all. But the next day he stopped again, and the day after that, each time a little longer, each time one step closer. No one spoke of it. Then there was the night in the library. Nova discovered the Voss estate library during her second week while cleaning the 3rd floor. The room was small compared to the rest of the house. Walls paneled in dark wood, 2 walls lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling, an old leather armchair by the window, and a reading lamp casting a soft yellow glow. It was the only room in the estate without cameras, Griffin had told her, because Declan wanted one place where no one could see him, not even his own security system. Nova began slipping up to the library every night after the children fell asleep, before 11, following the new rule. She read anything her hand could reach: novels, history, poetry, books she could never have afforded to buy, but here they were free, and no one forbade them. One night, she was curled in the armchair reading a collection of short stories when the door opened. Declan stepped in and stopped when he saw her. For a moment, they stood still, looking at each other in the yellow lamplight. Nova was ready to stand and leave, as rule number 4 required. But Declan said, "Stay, I'm just here for a book." He went to the shelf and pulled out a worn paperback. The spine cracked from being read too many times. He turned to leave, and then Nova saw the author's name. "Pablo Neruda," she said, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Declan paused. He looked down at the book in his hand, then back at her. "You read Neruda?" "I studied at Juilliard. We lived on Neruda and Chopin." Only after she spoke did she realize she had revealed more than she meant to. But Declan didn't ask about Juilliard. He looked at the book, his thumb rubbing lightly along the broken spine, and he said, "Elena liked Neruda. I reread it because he didn't finish." The sentence hung between them like a fragile thread. Neither of them dared to touch it because neither knew what it would pull loose. Then Declan gave a short nod, stepped out, and closed the door. The exchange had lasted less than a minute, but it was their first conversation that wasn't about the children, wasn't about rules, wasn't about orders or violations. It was simply 2 people standing in a room full of books and speaking about poetry. Then one evening, Nova went to tidy Thea's room before bedtime and saw the drawing. Thea had made it in crayon on a sheet of plain paper and placed it on the bed like a treasure. The picture showed 4 people standing beside a large black rectangle Nova recognized as the piano. 2 small figures, clearly children, stood in the middle. On the left was a long-haired blonde woman wearing gray. On the right was a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair. 4 people, not 5. No Elena. Nova stared at the drawing and felt something catch in her throat. She set it back exactly where it had been, finished cleaning, and left. She did not know that Declan had seen the drawing too. He saw it when he went in to check whether Thea was asleep, as he did every night, even though no one knew. He stood beside his daughter's bed, looking down at the crayon drawing with 4 people and a piano and no Elena, And he stood there for a long time, long enough that Griffin had to knock softly to remind him a call was waiting. That night at 9:45, there was a knock at Nova's door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She had just hung up after a call with her mother's hospital, and her eyes were still red, swollen, because the doctor had just said the next round of chemotherapy needed to begin in 2 weeks, and the cost would be double the last one. And Nova had sat on her bed counting the money in her account and realized that even if she saved every cent, it still wouldn't be enough. It would never be enough, because that is what poverty is. Not falling short once, but falling short forever. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand and opened the door. Declan Voss stood in the hallway, black shirt with the sleeves rolled up. No jacket, no weapon visible, but he still filled the doorway with broad shoulders and the heavy presence he carried everywhere. "Miss Ellis, I need to talk about Thea." But then he saw her eyes, red, swollen, still wet. And the question he had prepared, the question about the 4-person drawing, about Thea replacing Elena with Nova inside the child's imagination, and what that meant, evaporated off his tongue like water on hot iron. Instead, from the mouth of Declan Voss, East Coast Mafia boss, the man whose own people didn't dare meet his gaze, came a question he didn't even know he was capable of asking until it had already left his lips. "Are you all right?" Those 3 words hung in the air in Nova's doorway like an alien object dropped from another planet. "Are you all right?" No one asked Nova that. No one had asked for 3 years, not since her mother's diagnosis and Nova's life snapped cleanly in 2, between concert halls and hospital rooms. No one asked when she left Juilliard midway through her 3rd year, when her mentor told her she was throwing away a rare gift, when she nodded and said, "I know," and walked straight to an agency for day labor because hospital bills didn't wait for graduations. No one asked when she moved from job to job, 7 positions in 2 years, not because she was lazy or incapable, but because every time her mother landed in the emergency room, Nova had to miss work, and every time she missed work, she was replaced by someone who didn't have to. No one asked. And now the person asking her was the last person she would have expected in this world. Nova meant to say, "I'm fine." The 2 words she used most often, the 2 words she had said thousands of times to hundreds of people, smooth and automatic as a knee-jerk. But there was something in the way Declan asked, not the polite question asked on the way out, but the kind asked by someone who stayed still and waited for a real answer. Someone who could tell the difference between a true "I'm fine" and a false "I'm fine," because he himself had been saying the false version for 10 months. That single difference broke something in Nova's chest before she could stop it. She cried. Not a quiet cry, not damp eyes wiped away, but the kind of crying that comes after too much holding on, when the last wall finally collapses. She stood in the doorway of her tiny room in front of the East Coast Mafia boss and cried as if there were nothing left in the world worth preserving dignity for. And then she told him about her mother, about the cancer that had been eating her mother's body for 3 years, about the chemotherapy that scorched both the patient and the family bank account, about the day her mother held her hand in the hospital bed and said, "Don't leave school because of me." And Nova said, "I won't." Then the next morning filed her withdrawal because that month's bill was larger than a full year of scholarship. She told him about Juilliard, about the stage door opening in front of her when she was 19, about the feeling of sitting at a Steinway in a concert hall with 300 people below and knowing she had been born to do this, about a dream stolen not by any person, but by life itself, by fate, by the price of loving someone who was dying. Declan listened. He didn't sit down. He didn't step into her room. He didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He didn't say, "I understand," or "it'll be okay," or any of the hollow comforts people offer when they don't know what else to say. He simply stood there, back against the doorframe, arms folded, and listened. He listened the way he always listened, with focused silence, the silence of a man trained to hear the truth under words. Only this time he wasn't listening for betrayal or lies. He was listening because the person in front of him was hurting, and for a reason he couldn't explain, he didn't want to walk away. When Nova finally stopped, her eyes swollen, her voice rough, shame came crashing in like the surge after a storm. She had just spilled her insides to her employer, the man who paid her, the man who could dismiss her at any moment. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't." "My family doctor," Declan said, cutting through her apology in a calm, clear voice as if he were reading a contract clause. "His name is Dr. Langford. He is the best oncologist I know. I'll have Griffin give you his number tomorrow morning. Cost is not an issue." Nova shook her head immediately. "No, I can't accept that." "You can," Declan said, his tone level. "And this isn't charity, Miss Ellis. I don't do charity. This is debt. You've cared for my children. You made Thea cry when no one in this city could. That's a debt I haven't paid. I'm paying it." Nova wanted to refuse. Every nerve in her body, every year of surviving on her own, every night eating leftovers in the dark, and every morning waking up and telling herself she didn't need anyone. All of it screamed at her to say no. But then she thought of her mother. She thought of the doctor's voice on the phone 30 minutes earlier. She thought of the number she would never be able to reach, no matter how many floors she scrubbed in a day. And she understood that pride was a luxury. A woman on the verge of losing her mother didn't have the right to keep. "All right," she said, small and broken. "Thank you." Declan nodded. He said nothing more. He turned and walked down the hallway toward the study where Griffin was waiting. He shut the door, faced Griffin, and his voice snapped back into its familiar cadence of command. "Mount Sinai Hospital. Dr. Langford. Arrange an appointment for Miss Ellis's mother this week. Pay in full." Griffin nodded and pulled out his phone. "And Griffin." Griffin paused, looked up. "Don't let her know who paid. Use a shell company. Make sure no one can trace this payment back to me. No one." Griffin nodded again. He didn't ask why. 15 years beside Declan Voss had taught him there were questions that didn't need to be asked and answers that lived in places no one expected. But when Declan left the room and disappeared into the dark hallway, Griffin stood there for a long time, phone in hand, watching his employers retreating back. 15 years Griffin had seen Declan Voss walk through bullets, betrayals, and funerals without ever flinching. He had watched him bury his wife with eyes dry because tears were a luxury his world did not allow. He had watched him build a wall around himself so high light couldn't get in. But tonight, for the first time in 15 years, Griffin saw a crack in that wall. Not a crack made by bullets or enemies. A crack made by a 27-year-old woman with calloused hands and red, swollen eyes, standing in a staff doorway and crying. Griffin dialed the hospital and thought that of all the dangers he had ever seen threatened Declan Voss, the most dangerous turned out not to be a gun, not a traitor, but the sign of a heart trying to beat again. The file lay on the backseat table of the black Bentley as Eleanor Voss read it on the drive from her attorney's office to her private residence. 12 pages. Everything was there. Nova Ellis, 27 years old, born in Philadelphia, raised by a single mother named Beatrice Ellis, now undergoing treatment for stage 3 cancer at a public hospital with unpaid bills piling up. Her father left when Nova was 2, leaving nothing behind except his name on a birth certificate. Nova entered Juilliard on a full scholarship at 18, labeled one of the finest piano talents of her class, then withdrew midway through her 3rd year when her mother received the diagnosis. After that came the long list. 7 jobs in 2 years, from restaurant dishwashing to hotel housekeeping to office floor cleaning, none lasting more than a few months, each termination lining up with a fresh hospitalization, overdue credit debt, evicted from a rented apartment for non-payment. Lived in a shelter for 3 months before being hired into the Voss estate. Eleanor closed the file. She did not smile, but her eyes brightened with the cold light of a woman who had found exactly what she needed. Poor. In debt. Desperate. Perfect. She called Mrs. Hargrove that evening. Mrs. Hargrove, 61 years old, head housekeeper at the Voss estate for 14 years, personally hired by Eleanor, before Declan ever married Elena, a woman whose true loyalty did not belong to Eleanor's son but to Eleanor herself. The two women spoke for 30 minutes on the phone. When the call ended, each of them knew exactly what she would do. Step 1. Mrs. Hargrove would call the estate security technicians on Monday morning and report that the cameras in the staff corridor were flickering oddly and needed maintenance. It was not an unusual request. As head housekeeper, she coordinated regularly with technical staff on all operations, and no one questioned her when she asked for the staff area cameras to be shut down for 24 hours so the technicians could check the wiring. Eleanor understood the estate security system because she had lived there for 12 years before Declan took over. She knew which camera covered which angle. She knew where the blind spots were. She knew the main hallway and living room cameras were on a different system than the staff corridor cameras, so disabling one did not affect the other. The kind of maneuver used by someone who understood a fortress from the inside. Step 2. During the 24 hours the staff cameras were offline, Mrs. Hargrove would enter Declan's primary bedroom with the spare key she kept as head housekeeper and open the smaller safe inside the closet where Declan stored Elena's personal belongings, the ones he could not bear to throw away, but also could not bear to look at. She would take out the Cartier watch with the mother-of-pearl face, the watch Elena wore in the wedding photograph, the watch she wore on her last night at the restaurant before the bullet changed everything. The watch removed from her wrist at the hospital and returned to Declan in a clear plastic bag alongside her wedding ring and earrings. Mrs. Hargrove carried the watch down to the staff quarters, entered Nova's room, and placed it at the bottom of the bedside desk drawer beneath a few old sheet music books. She was in and out in less than 2 minutes. No one saw, because no camera was running in that area. Step 3. Eleanor would visit the estate on Wednesday. She would have tea with Declan in his study, speak about the grandchildren, about schools for the fall, and then, in a perfectly casual tone, she would say, "By the way, have you checked your safe lately? I read in the paper that internal theft has surged this year. You have people coming and going. It can't hurt to be careful." Declan did not suspect. Why would he suspect his own mother? He opened the smaller safe that afternoon, prompted by the routine caution his mother had just planted, and he saw it immediately. The Cartier watch was gone. The empty space where it should have been yawned like a hole in his chest. The last object to touch Elena's skin, missing. Declan called Griffin. Griffin checked the cameras. The staff corridor cameras had no footage from Monday and Tuesday because they were under maintenance. The main hallway cameras showed nothing unusual. The safe showed no signs of forced entry, meaning whoever took it had a key or knew the code. Griffin reported in a careful voice that only 3 people had access to the primary bedroom without advance notice. Declan himself, Mrs. Hargrove as head housekeeper, and the assigned housekeeper, currently Nova Ellis. That was when Mrs. Hargrove knocked on the study door. She entered wearing a perfectly worried grimace, holding the Cartier watch wrapped in a white cloth. "Mr. Voss, I found this in Miss Ellis's room. I was checking the staff rooms on schedule, and it was in her bedside desk drawer." Declan stared at the watch. The mother-of-pearl face shimmered under the desk lamp. The leather strap had softened into the shape of Elena's wrist, still holding that curve even after 10 months of no one wearing it. He picked it up. His hand did not shake, but his jaw tightened so hard Griffin could hear his teeth grind from across the room. "Bring Miss Ellis here." Nova entered the study 2 minutes later, hands still wet from washing dishes downstairs, gray uniform spotted with a few drops of soapy water. She saw the watch on the desk before she saw anything else, and she froze. Then she saw Eleanor seated on the sofa by the window, legs crossed, hands on her knee, her face wearing a sorrowful compassion so perfectly sculpted it could have been framed and hung in a museum. Then she saw Declan, and she understood. "Miss Ellis," Declan said, his voice not flat but lowered. lowered the way water sinks just before it forms a whirlpool and pulls everything down. That watch belonged to my wife. It was in the safe in my bedroom, and it has just been found in your drawer. Do you have an explanation?" It was not a question. It was a verdict waiting to be spoken. Nova looked at the watch, looked at Declan, looked at Eleanor, and in a single instant she understood everything, clear and sharp as the final note of Claire de Lune. She understood she had been set up. She understood this trap was not laid by an impatient hand. She understood every piece, the debt, the unstable past, the fact that she had access to the primary bedroom, had been arranged to point in only one direction, toward her. "I didn't take that watch," Nova said, her voice so calm she surprised herself. "I have never opened your safe. I don't know the code and I don't have a key." "You have access to the primary bedroom to clean it," Declan said. "Yes, to clean, not to steal." Eleanor spoke from the sofa, her voice perfectly soft and wounded. "I don't want to believe this, Declan, but you have to look at the facts. She is struggling. Her mother is very ill. She needs money. That watch is worth more than her annual salary. Sometimes desperation makes people—" "I'm not so desperate that I steal from the dead," Nova said, and the sentence cut through Eleanor like a blade through silk. The room fell silent. Declan looked at Nova. His eyes now were not the eyes of a father, not the eyes of the man in the library speaking of Neruda, not the eyes that had asked, "Are you all right?" His eyes now were the eyes of Declan Voss, the Mafia boss, the man who had lost his wife to violence and would not lose another piece of her to anyone. That watch was the last thing Elena had touched. And to Declan, it wasn't jewelry. It was remains. It was a relic. And someone had taken it. "Get out of my house," he said. His voice did not rise. It did not tremble. It was flat as frozen water, the kind of surface beneath which lies deep black cold that can kill. "Before I call the police." Nova looked at him, and Declan saw something in her eyes he wasn't prepared to face. Not fear, not panic, not even anger, disappointment. The absolute disappointment of someone who had started to believe and had just been betrayed by that belief. The disappointment of the woman who had stood barefoot among broken glass and said, "A man like that doesn't scare me," and now realized she might have been wrong. Nova turned to Eleanor. She sat on the sofa, spine straight, eyes unblinking, perfect and untouchable. "I didn't take the watch," Nova said one last time, her voice strangely steady, "but I think you know who did." Eleanor did not move. Not a single muscle betrayed her. Declan slammed his hand on the desk. "Enough! Out now!" Nova stood tall. She did not bow her head. She did not apologize. She did not cry. She looked at Declan once more. And in that look was both farewell and a question she did not speak. "Do you truly believe I would do that?" Then she turned and walked out of the room, back straight, head high, her footsteps even and steady on the marble. And it was the only time in Nova Ellis's life she felt grateful for 3 years of poverty that had taught her how to keep walking even when the ground fell away beneath her. Nova packed in 15 minutes. She didn't need more time because she didn't have more. The old duffel bag she'd carried in on her first day still held everything she owned in the world. 3 changes of clothes, a worn pair of slippers, a few broken spine music books, and the Juilliard photograph in the cheap plastic frame Eleanor had picked up and set back down weeks earlier. She folded the gray uniform neatly and left it on the bed with the room key. Then she sat at the desk, took 2 blank sheets from the stack of paper she'd taken from the small office near the kitchen the week before, and wrote. The first sheet was music for Thea, a simple melody she had composed during the afternoons sitting beside the girl, easy enough for a 7-year-old to play with one hand with small notes in the margins. Middle C, index finger gently don't rush. The second sheet was music for Iris, the elephant song. Nova drew a little elephant beside the first note so Iris would recognize it, and underneath she wrote, Press hard so the elephant is really big. Iris's elephant can fly. Remember. She laid the 2 sheets on the closed piano lid as she passed through the living room, gently, the way you lay flowers on a grave. She had reached the front door when tiny footsteps sounded behind her, fast and frantic little slaps on the marble. "Miss Piano!" Iris came flying down the hallway, cheeks flushed, tears already carving 2 long tracks down her face, nose running, short legs pumping so hard she nearly tripped on the edge of the rug. She crashed into Nova's legs and wrapped both arms around Nova's knees with the ferocious strength of a 5-year-old terrified of losing one more person. "Where are you going? Where is Miss Piano going? Don't go! You can't go!" Nova dropped to her knees. The cold stone bit through her skin as she came level with Iris's face, looking straight into those wet brown eyes, and every nerve in her body was screaming at her to cry, to let it out, but she didn't, because if she cried, Iris would break completely and Nova couldn't do that to her. "Listen to Miss Piano," Nova said, her voice steady and warm even though inside she was splintering. "Iris, you have to play every day, all right? The elephant song, the flying elephant song. Promise, Miss Piano, promise." Iris sobbed. Small hand clamped around Nova's wrist. "But Miss Piano has to promise, too. Promise you will." She couldn't finish because her tears swallowed the rest. Then Iris did something Nova didn't expect. She shoved a small folded paper into Nova's hand, wrinkled from being gripped too tightly for who knows how long. Nova opened it. A crayon drawing. A big house with yellow windows, a black rectangle Nova recognized as the piano, 4 stick figures standing together, too small, too tall, and underneath, in the crooked practice letters of a 5-year-old just learning to write, misspelled, slanted, uneven, yet so clear each letter felt like a blade in Nova's chest. "Miss Piano, please come home." Nova bit her lower lip, bit until the taste of metal spread across her tongue. She bit because if she didn't, she would scream in the foyer of this house and never stop. She folded the drawing and tucked it into her bra pocket, hugged Iris one last time, then stood, gently but firmly pried the child's hands away and walked toward the door. The nanny ran in and lifted Iris up. Iris screamed and kicked the air, reaching for Nova. Her crying filled the high-ceiling entryway, bounced off stone walls, multiplied tenfold. Nova didn't turn around, not because she didn't want to, but because if she did, she would never be able to leave. But as she reached the door, she felt someone watching her. Nova looked up. Thea stood on the staircase halfway up, where the stairs turned to the right. The girl stood with one hand gripping the banister and the other hanging at her side. She didn't cry. She didn't call out. She didn't run down. She only stood and watched Nova with the eyes of a 7-year-old who had seen too much loss for such a short life. There were no tears in those eyes, only emptiness. The emptiness of a child who had learned that the people she loved would leave. And this time she didn't even bother to cry because crying wouldn't keep anyone. Nova looked at Thea. Thea looked at Nova. And in that moment, the silence between them hurt more than all of Iris's crying combined, because crying was at least life, and Thea's silence was a door slamming shut after it had barely cracked open. Nova stepped out. The front door closed behind her with a soft, decisive click. The Voss estate swallowed Iris's cries inside its thick walls and returned perfect silence to the world outside. That night, the house reverted to the tomb-like state it had lived in for 10 months before Nova arrived. Iris cried until there were no tears left, then no strength left, then fell asleep on the living room sofa with her hand clenched in her dreams. Thea sat in front of the closed piano, both hands resting on the glossy black wood, motionless, exactly like the night before Declan called Nova back the first time. Only this time, Declan wasn't sure there would be another chance to call again. He sat in his study, door shut, lights off, the Cartier watch on the desk in front of him. The mother-of-pearl face glimmered faintly in moonlight slipping through the window. He stared at it for a long time, and something was wrong. Not wrong with the watch, wrong with everything. 15 years in the underworld had given Declan Voss something no university could teach: the instinct to recognize when he was being played. That instinct had saved him from 3 ambushes, 2 internal betrayals, and countless dirty deals. That instinct was screaming in his ear now, screaming with cold clarity. She didn't do it. The evidence was too perfect, too clean, too convenient. In Declan's world, nothing convenient was real. Anything convenient was a trap. Then Nova's last sentence echoed in his mind, so clear it was as if she were standing in the room. "I think you know who did it." Declan opened his laptop, logged into the security system, checked the camera logs, and he saw it immediately. The staff area cameras had been shut off for 24 hours from Monday morning to Tuesday morning. The stated reason in the system: wiring maintenance requested by Mrs. Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove. Declan stared at that name on the screen and felt something colder than anger begin to spread through his chest. He switched to the main hallway cameras. The main hallway ran on a different system, unaffected by the staff area maintenance order. Eleanor knew the staff corridor cameras but forgot, or didn't know, that the main hallway still covered a short stretch where the 2 areas intersected. Declan rewound Monday and he saw it. Clear, sharp, impossible to deny. Mrs. Hargrove walked from the main hall into the staff corridor in the afternoon. In her hand, wrapped tightly in a white cloth, was the Cartier watch with the mother-of-pearl face. 4 minutes later, she returned to the main hall empty-handed. Declan paused the video. The screen froze on Mrs. Hargrove walking down the hall with an empty hand and the calm face of someone who had just completed an ordinary task. He sat motionless in the dark. The blood in his veins turned to ice, not from cold but from realizing he had just driven away the only person who had brought his daughter back to life on a lie built by his own mother. Declan called Eleanor at 6 a.m. No explanation, no invitation, just 4 words. "Come here right now." Eleanor arrived within 40 minutes, faster than usual, perhaps because she heard something in her son's voice she had never heard before. Not anger, not coldness. The kind of calm a person reaches only after moving through all anger and arriving on the far shore where everything becomes brutally clear. She entered the study and saw Declan already seated behind the desk, the laptop open. Griffin standing near the window. No tea, no sofa. Declan pointed to the chair opposite his desk, the chair he reserved for subordinates delivering reports and people being questioned. Eleanor looked at that chair and understood the message, but she sat anyway, spine straight, chin lifted, because Eleanor Voss never allowed anyone to see her retreat by even half an inch. "You know why you're here," Declan said. It wasn't a question. "I assume it's about the housekeeper," Eleanor replied, calm, even faintly tired, as if the subject had grown tedious. Declan didn't answer. He turned the laptop toward her and pressed play. The screen showed the main hallway camera, an angle covering the junction between the corridor and the staff wing. Mrs. Hargrove entered the frame, her familiar posture, back straight, steps even, one hand gripping a white cloth wrapped around a small object. She walked toward the staff wing. 4 minutes later, she returned empty-handed. Eleanor watched the screen. Her face did not change for the first 2 seconds. Perfect, untouchable. Then, so slight it was almost unreal, her left eye twitched once. Just once. But Declan saw it. He had spent his life reading faces for lies, and his mother's face was no exception. "You told Mrs. Hargrove to take Elena's watch from the safe in my bedroom," Declan said. Each word clear, slow, level. "You told her to hide it in Nova's room. You told her to shut off the staff cameras to erase the trail. Then you came here for tea and suggested I check the safe. And when the watch was found in Nova's room, you sat on that sofa with your sympathetic face and watched me throw her out." Silence. Eleanor drew a slow breath through her nose, let it out lightly, and then spoke in the voice she had used her whole life to turn wrong doing into morality. "I did it for you, Declan, for my grandchildren. She is dangerous. She is replacing Elena in this house, in the children's eyes. And if you weren't blind, you would see it. You didn't do it for me, Declan replied, his voice so cold that Griffin, who had heard that tone in every imaginable situation, tightened his hands behind his back. You did it for control, the way you always have. Control me. Control Elena when she was alive. Control the children, and now control who is allowed to step into this house. Eleanor didn't blink. She sat even straighter, as if that were possible, and struck back with the only weapon she knew could pierce her son's armor: truth. Or at least the version of truth she needed Declan to believe. You think that housekeeper truly cares about you, Eleanor said, her voice gentle and precise as a scalpel. About the children, Declan. She is dirt poor. Her mother is lying in a public hospital waiting to die. She jumped jobs 7 times in 2 years. Why do you think she stayed in this house? Because of love? Because of piano? Don't be naive. You are her ticket out of poverty. You are the rich widower with 2 children who need a mother. She isn't caring for them because she is good. She is caring for them because it is the only way to attach herself to your life. The words landed. Declan didn't move, but Griffin saw his jaw tighten and his gray eyes flick once, fast, as if something had flown through and cut him. Because Eleanor had touched the deepest fear Declan carried, the fear of being used, the fear that people came close, not for who he was, but for what he had, the fear that every kindness had a price and every smile was calculated, because in his world that was true. Everything had a price. And Nova was poor. Nova was in debt. Nova had a dying mother. Nova had every reason in the world to cling to Declan Voss, not because of him, but because of his money. Declan wavered just for a second, but 1 second was enough for Eleanor to see, to know the blade had gone in. She opened her mouth to press further, to drive it deeper, to kill any chance Nova Ellis ever returned to this house. But she didn't get the chance because the study door opened. No knock, no permission. The heavy oak door swung on its hinges with a small creak, and in the doorway stood a 7-year-old child in pink pajamas, hair a tangled halo, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a piece of paper crushed from being squeezed too many times. Thea. The girl stood there and looked into the room. At her father, at her grandmother, at Griffin. Then she opened her mouth, and the sound that came out after 10 months of absolute silence, 10 months without a word, without a whisper, without any sound beyond breath, was so small it almost didn't exist. Hoarse, broken, cracked like thin glass, splitting in winter but clear, each word clear. Bring Miss Piano back. The room stopped breathing. Eleanor went rigid in the chair. Griffin leaned against the wall as if his legs could no longer hold his weight. Declan looked at his daughter and everything in him, every wall, every layer of armor, every hard year of his life, shattered at once. "Grandma lied," Thea said next, her voice trembling but not stopping, as if she had held these words inside her chest for 10 months, and now they were pouring out beyond control. "I saw Mrs. Hargrove hide it in Miss Piano's room. I saw it." Eleanor turned pale. Not pale because she had been caught. Not pale because the evidence against her was now more than camera footage. It was a living witness. Pale because her granddaughter, the child she claimed she wanted to protect, had spoken for the first time in 10 months. And the first thing she chose to say in this world, after 10 months of silence, was to accuse her. Declan rose from his chair. No. He didn't rise. He fell. Both knees hit the stone floor in front of his daughter, and the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast knelt on the floor of his own study, pulled the 7-year-old into his arms, and finally broke. Declan Voss cried. For the first time since the night he held Elena on the restaurant floor and watched the light go out in her eyes. For the first time in 10 months, not crying from pain, but crying because his daughter was back. crying because that small, hoarse voice was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. More beautiful than any music, more beautiful than any oath of loyalty, more beautiful than anything his empire could buy. Thea held her father back. Her tiny hand clutched the fabric of his black shirt, and she said more, still hoarse but stronger now. "I want Miss Piano. She is not bad. She is good. She plays Mommy's song and it makes me remember. I don't want to forget Mommy. Please, Papa." Declan held her tighter, his face pressed into her hair, and for a long moment he couldn't speak because his throat was strangled by 10 months of tears that had never fallen, now spilling out all at once. Then he lifted his head, looked at Eleanor. His eyes were red and wet, but his voice did not shake. "Leave. Don't come back. When I'm ready, I'll call. But not today and not tomorrow." Eleanor stood. For the first time in 63 years, she had no reply. She looked at her granddaughter in her son's arms, at the crumpled paper Thea still held tight. The paper with music notes and the line, "Gently, don't rush," Nova had written. And she walked out of the study without looking back. Her footsteps in the hallway for the first time did not sound steady. "Griffin," Declan said, his face still buried in Thea's hair. "Mrs. Hargrove, terminate her now. She has 15 minutes to leave." "Yes, sir." "And Griffin." "Sir?" Declan lifted his head, holding Thea with one arm, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand in an awkward motion, unfamiliar, like a man performing something his body had forgotten how to do. "Find her. Find Nova now." Griffin nodded and stepped out. But before he crossed the threshold, he looked back once. Declan Voss sat on the cold stone floor holding his daughter, eyes red, shirt wrinkled, and in those storm-gray eyes Griffin saw something he had never seen in 15 years beside his boss. Fear. Not fear of enemies, not fear of bullets, fear that it was already too late. Declan called Nova's number the moment Griffin left the room. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Then it cut off. Not voicemail, cut off. She saw his name on the screen and hit decline. He called again. This time, it didn't even finish the first ring before it cut off. Declan stared at the phone in his hand. And that feeling, the simple, ridiculous feeling of calling someone and being refused, hit him harder than any bullet that had ever grazed his head. Because in 15 years, no one on earth had ever dared ignore a call from Declan Voss. And the first person to do it was the 27-year-old woman he had just accused and thrown out of his house. Thea was still on his lap, clutching the crumpled sheet music, and she said in a hoarse voice, each word clear, "Find her, Papa." Griffin came back 12 minutes later, phone in hand, face tight. "Sir, she bought a bus ticket to Portland. Departure this morning from the Greyhound terminal on 42nd Street. Declan checked his watch. 8:47, 43 minutes. He sat Thea down on the chair, smoothed her hair, and said, "I'm bringing her back. You stay here with Griffin." Then he stood, took his car keys from the desk drawer, and walked into the hallway. Griffin followed. "I'll call the driver team and security to go with you." "No." Declan stopped and turned to Griffin. "No drivers, no security, no one comes with me." "Sir, you shouldn't go out alone. Level 3 security is still in effect since last month." "Griffin." Declan said his guard's name not as an order, but almost as a request. Something Griffin had never heard. "She has seen enough of my world already. She has seen guards. She has seen guns. She has seen a midnight meeting. She has seen me order a man to disappear. She has seen all of it and she stayed. Then I threw her out." He paused. "This time she needs to see me, just me, nothing else." Griffin looked at his boss. 15 years. Declan Voss had never gone anywhere without at least one man at his side. Never. But Griffin nodded, stepped aside, and let him pass. Declan drove the black Audi out through the estate gates at 8:51. Alone, no armor, no bodyguards, only the black suit he had been wearing since the night before because he hadn't slept and hadn't changed, his shirt collar slightly wrinkled hair uncombed, eyes red from crying, and he didn't bother to hide it. He drove through the city in the morning rush, past streets he controlled block by block, past neighborhoods where his name was whispered with fear, and none of the thousands of people on the sidewalks knew that the man behind the wheel of the black Audi was racing the clock to a bus station to ask a housekeeper for forgiveness. The Greyhound terminal on 42nd Street was not a place Declan Voss belonged. Dirty gray concrete floors, scratched green plastic seats, the smell of diesel mixed with cheap coffee and the damp odor of old luggage. Working people waited with backpacks on their laps, tired eyes, worn coats, and in the middle of it all, Declan Voss walked in wearing a black suit that cost more than 3 months of wages for most people there. Polished leather shoes bright against filthy concrete, so out of place that a few heads turned. He didn't care. His eyes swept the terminal. First row, no. Second row, no. Ticket counter, no. Coffee corner, and no. Then he saw her. The last row against the wall, beneath the blinking departures board. Nova sat there, her old duffel bag at her feet, hands on her lap, eyes fixed straight ahead but seeing nothing. The eyes of someone so exhausted that even looking was an effort. She wasn't crying. She had used up her tears the night before in a shelter on a hard bunk, face buried in a thin pillow so no one would hear. Now she was only an empty shell waiting for the bus to arrive and take her anywhere that wasn't here. Declan walked over. His shadow fell across the concrete before she looked up. She lifted her head and froze. For a moment her eyes widened, and in them flashed shock, then hurt, then anger, then something she tried to crush before it could rise, something like hope. And she killed it instantly, and her face went blank again. "Miss Ellis," Declan said. He stood in front of her in that dusty bus station, arms at his sides, and he looked less like an East Coast Mafia boss than a man standing in court waiting for sentence. Nova didn't answer. She watched him with a flat gaze, the kind she had learned from him, the kind that gave nothing and took nothing. "I was wrong," Declan said. The words left his mouth heavier than any command he had ever given, because Declan Voss didn't say, "I was wrong," to anyone. Not to his men, not to his enemies, not to his mother. But he was saying it to the woman sitting on a green plastic seat in a bus terminal. "My mother set you up. She had Mrs. Hargrove hide Elena's watch in your room. The cameras prove it. Mrs. Hargrove has been terminated." Nova still didn't speak. "I knew," Declan went on, and his voice began to fray at the edges, small and cracked, in a way he never allowed in front of anyone in this world except his daughters, and now her. "I knew somewhere in my instincts that you didn't take that watch, but I let fear decide for me. Fear that if I believed you, I'd lose one more person. Fear that hope would come back and be ripped away again. I let that fear turn me into the thing I hate most." He stopped, looked straight into her eyes. An unjust man. Silence. The terminal loudspeaker announced the Albany departure was delayed by 20 minutes. A child cried somewhere near the ticket counter. Diesel engines hummed outside. "Thea spoke," Declan said, and when he said his daughter's name, his voice softened in a way nothing else in the world could soften it. "For the first time in 10 months. Do you know what she said?" Nova looked at him, and for the first time, the blank mask on her face cracked. "Bring Miss Piano back," Declan said. Nova drew a short, sharp breath as if she'd been stabbed. Then Declan reached into his suit pocket and took out a small, folded paper, wrinkled, edges curled. The paper Iris had shoved into Nova's hand. The paper Nova had tucked into her bra pocket before she walked out of the estate. The paper she had dropped in the foyer when the door closed because her hands were shaking too hard to hold anything. The paper Griffin had picked up and brought to Declan. Declan placed it in Nova's hand. She opened it. The crayon drawing. The house, the piano, 4 stick figures, and the slanted, crooked words, "Miss Piano, come home." Nova stared at the drawing and the last wall collapsed. Tears fell onto the paper, soaking into the waxy color, smearing Iris's scribbled letters. She cried, not because she forgave him. Forgiveness wasn't here yet. Forgiveness took time, and Nova knew that. She cried because she remembered. She remembered Iris's voice calling Miss Piano down the hallway. She remembered Thea's hands pulling her wrist to the keys. She remembered the hot breakfast tray on the kitchen table every morning with no explanation. She remembered the night she stood barefoot among broken glass and said, "A man like that doesn't scare me," and remembered she had meant it. A bus engine roared outside. The loudspeaker announced Portland departure this morning, now boarding. Passengers, please proceed to Gate 7. Nova looked toward the glass doors. The white and blue Greyhound bus waited outside, doors open, passengers lining up with backpacks and rolling suitcases. Portland, an old friend from Juilliard, a tiny rented room, a new life safe, no Mafia boss, no forbidden piano piece, no manipulative grandmother, no late-night orders to make men disappear, no pain, but also no Thea, no Iris, no flying elephant song. Nova stood and picked up her bag. Declan didn't move. He didn't speak again. He didn't grab her hand. He didn't block her path. He simply stood there and held out his right hand. The hand with black ink running from wrist to elbow, a long scar across the back from a night Nova would never need to know. The hand that had signed orders, held guns, slammed down on a desk when he threw her out. That hand was extended now, palm up, empty in the dusty bus terminal, and it waited. Nova looked at the bus, looked at his hand, looked at the bus, looked at his hand. The loudspeaker made its final call. Portland, Gate 7, departing in 2 minutes. Nova tucked Iris's drawing back into her bra pocket. Then she placed her hand in his. Her hand was small, calloused, raw in places from scrubbing. His was large, inked, scarred, warmer than she expected. Their fingers closed. "The bus can go," Nova said. Declan exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since the moment he walked into the terminal, or perhaps since the moment he threw her out, or perhaps since 10 months earlier when Elena stopped breathing in his arms. He bent, lifted Nova's old duffel bag from beneath her seat, and slung it over his own shoulder. The East Coast Mafia boss in a wrinkled black suit, eyes red, standing in the Greyhound terminal on 42nd Street with a torn duffel on his shoulder, holding 3 cheap changes of clothes, a few broken-spine music books, a worn pair of slippers, and a Juilliard photograph in a plastic frame. He carried it as if it were the most precious thing he had ever carried in his life. In some way, it was. "Let's go home," he said, and they walked out of the terminal together, leaving behind the bus doors closing as the Portland coach pulled away without Nova Ellis on board. 6 months later, if someone drove past the Voss estate on a Sunday afternoon, they wouldn't hear silence. They would hear piano. Not the flawless piano of a concert hall, but messy, joyful piano threaded with children's laughter and shrieks spilling out through wide-open windows that 10 months earlier had never been opened, because Declan Voss believed closed windows meant safety. Now the windows were open. Sunlight poured in, and the Steinway Grand's lid was never closed anymore. Inside, the Voss estate was no longer a fortress. The white leather sofas that no one had dared sit on had been shoved against the wall, marked with crayon streaks. A teddy bear slumped on its side. The cold marble floor now held a thick, cream fur rug Iris had chosen because she said it felt like cat fur. And right in the middle of the living room in front of the piano, Declan Voss sat on the bench. He wore a white t-shirt, gray sweatpants, bare feet on stone. No suit, no black shirt, no polished leather shoes. The tattoos on his left arm were fully exposed, and Iris had drawn a flower in marker across the ink, and he hadn't washed it off because she would cry if he did. He was trying to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, trying because fingers built for gripping and commanding didn't know how to touch piano keys gently. Every note he pressed was either too hard or a little off, and Iris sat beside him on the bench, short legs swinging without reaching the floor, laughing so hard she nearly rolled off. "Papa, wrong note, wrong. That note is sol, not la." "Papa is playing a special version," Declan said, face serious. But the corners of his eyes creased in a way no one in that house would have imagined 10 months earlier. "A special bad version," Iris yelled, then dissolved into giggles. Thea stood behind the bench with her hands on her hips, her voice soft but clear, the crisp authority of a 7-year-old director losing patience with the worst student in class. "Pinky finger, Papa. Pinky, not your whole fist. This is a piano, not a punching bag." Declan looked at his older daughter. She talked now, not as much as Iris, not loud, not nonstop, but clearly and with intention, every sentence carrying weight, every word chosen with care, as if she understood the value of language more than anyone because she had lived 10 months without it. Her voice was still a little hoarse, still lighter than most children's voices, but it was here, and every day it grew a little stronger, a little clearer, like a young plant pushing through a crack in concrete, slow but unstoppable. Nova stood in the kitchen doorway, shoulder against the frame, arms folded, smiling. She wasn't wearing the gray uniform anymore. Today she wore a simple pale blue dress, blonde hair loose on her shoulders, slippers on her feet. She wasn't a housekeeper anymore. She didn't have an official title in this house, and no one needed her to. Because titles were just labels, and what Nova was couldn't be contained by any label. She was the person Iris ran to first every morning, the person Thea sat beside each afternoon at the piano, the person Declan looked across the room at with eyes nothing like the cold gray eyes he used for the rest of the world. She was the heart-pumping blood through the whole house. Declan had rearranged everything. He was still Declan Voss, still the name people whispered, still the head of an empire the police couldn't touch. But he handed most daily operations to Griffin. He came home at 5 every afternoon, no exceptions. Griffin told the kitchen staff one morning when she asked whether the boss had retired, "He's still the most dangerous man in this city. It's just that now he's most dangerous from 5 in the afternoon to 9 in the morning. The rest of the day, he's the worst piano student I've ever seen." Nova had returned to piano. Every morning after the children went to school, she drove to a music school downtown and sat at a practice piano for 4 hours. She found the acceptance letter on the Steinway lid one Monday morning in a white envelope with a handwritten note in Declan's hard, angular script. "Don't argue. This is a debt." She stared at that letter for 5 minutes. Then she laughed. Then she cried. Then she laughed again. Nova's mother, Beatrice, was finally in remission. She was weaker than before, her hair growing back short and silver, but her eyes were bright, and Dr. Langford said her numbers were moving in the right direction. She lived in the guest house behind the estate, a small one-bedroom cottage Declan had renovated without asking anyone, because asking meant giving Nova a chance to refuse, and he'd learned she would refuse anything if she could. Beatrice became the grandmother Thea and Iris had never had. Every night she told them fairy tales before bed, stories of princesses and castles. But in Beatrice's version, the princess always saved herself instead of waiting for a prince. She hid candy in the pockets of her knit cardigan and acted like no one knew. But everyone knew, even Declan. And he said nothing, because that was the kind of secret this house needed. "All right, everyone in position," Nova said, stepping from the kitchen doorway into the living room with a light, graceful stride that 3 years of scrubbing floors hadn't stolen. "Your teacher is about to check your lesson." "Teacher, you can't save Papa," Iris said solemnly. "Papa's hands are so big he hits 3 notes at once." "Papa has a good attitude," Nova said, winking at Declan. "And in music, like in life, attitude is the most important thing." Declan looked at her, and in those gray eyes, the eyes the whole city feared, the eyes his men didn't dare meet, there was only one thing now: warmth, pure, unhidden. Nova sat on the bench, nudged Declan over, and placed her hands on the keys. Thea stood on the left. Iris sat on the right, her legs still swinging. Declan sat close beside Nova, shoulder touching shoulder, and Nova played. Not Clair de Lune, not Chopin, not Beethoven. A piece she had composed during her mornings at the music school. A piece without a title, written for this house, for these people. The melody was gentle, warm, imperfect, because there were still passages she was refining, but it was alive, full of light, full of laughter hidden between the notes. Iris began to press a few messy notes along with it. Thea hummed softly, a small, clear voice like a wind chime. Declan didn't play because he knew he would ruin it, so he sat still, listening and looking. He looked to the mantel. Their wedding photo was still there in the same silver frame. Elena still smiled from the picture, her eyes still bright, and Declan looked at her without feeling a blade twisting in his chest any more. Instead, there was peace. The peace of a man who understood that loving again wasn't betrayal, that new happiness didn't erase old happiness, that Elena would want this house to have music, laughter, life, because that was exactly what she had brought when she was here. Beside the wedding photo taped to the wall was Thea's crayon drawing, 4 stick figures standing beside the piano, 2 small, 2 big, and above them a huge sun-colored bright yellow with naive zigzag rays. Declan reached over and took Nova's hand while she was still playing. She didn't stop, just played with one hand while her other hand held his. No labels, no explanations for the outside world about what they were to each other. They were family, forged in storm, bound by music and loyalty. This house was silent for too long, Declan said, his voice low, meant only for Nova. From now on, I want music. I want laughter. I want life. Nova tilted her head toward him, lips close to his ear, and whispered, "Thank you for letting us in, Mr. Voss." Declan smiled, a real smile, the kind Griffin would say he had never seen in 15 years. "Thank you for breaking down the door, Nova." The music continued. Notes flowed through the open windows, drifted outside, mixed with the afternoon breeze, and if someone passed the Voss estate in that moment, they would hear music, laughter, and the sound of a father hitting the wrong note and getting scolded by 2 daughters. They would never guess that the house had once been a tomb, that the man inside had once commanded a city, that the woman at the piano had once eaten leftovers in the dark, that the child humming by the window had once been silent for 10 months. They would only hear music, and sometimes that was enough. The Voss estate, once a fortress of darkness and silence, now vibrated with the heartbeat of a life returning. Not an ending in silence, an ending in music, in laughter, in life. This is the story of Declan Voss, the man who believed closing a piano lid could close grief, of Nova Ellis, the woman who thought she was only a floor scrubber but turned out to be the one who opened a door and let an entire family out of the dark, of Thea, the child who taught us that sometimes the right words at the right time carry more power than an empire, and of Iris, who reminds us that love doesn't need a reason, it only needs courage. The lesson of this story is simple. Silence doesn't protect anyone. Only love can do that. And sometimes the person who heals you isn't the best doctor or the most expensive specialist, but an ordinary person brave enough to step into your life with an honest heart and hands that aren't afraid of getting hurt. If this story touched you, if you saw yourself in Nova or in Declan or in little Thea, leave a comment and share what you felt. We always want to hear what comes from deep inside each heart, because every story you leave in the comments is the most precious source of inspiration for us. How does this story connect to your real life? Have you ever been the one to open a door for someone, or are you waiting for someone to open a door for you? Please like this video, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear more heart-touching stories every day. We sincerely thank all of you for staying with us to the very end. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, peaceful days, and music in your heart even when life goes quiet. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.